The reality of light infantry is far more complex, more subtle, and more interesting than anything you have read in Sharpe. Whilst there are certain corners of the internet within which that comment might get you stoned to death, the majority of us are well aware that light infantry troops were not engaged in some SAS style operations led by men with Yorkshire accents with an insistence on questioning the legitimacy of everyone they didn't like. Which raises the question, if we strip away the mythology, what was the actual history of light infantry troops? Tonight, our 18th century way of war deep dive returns as we take aim at the light troops of varying nations in the decades before the Napoleonic Wars. We ask whether light infantry were really all that new, whether they've always been overhyped, and why what they were doing wasn't actually all that special. This is Light Infantry of the 18th Century. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and another installment of our 18th Century Way of War series. You might have noticed the unrepentant Sharpe bashing in that opening. Zero apologies are going to be given, even if I have alienated everybody who loves the 95th Rifles. What can I say? I'm not sorry. But there's a lot of approval for my Sharpe bashing in the room this evening. Our usual cast of brilliant commentators and scholars returns for this one. Alex Burns is in the house, assistant professor of history at Franciscan University in Steubenville. Alex, is your book out yet with Hellion?
It is actually today off to the printers, so it should be available maybe by Christmas, but probably early January.
Fantastic. Okay, so folks, go and check the Hellion website. This is a really exciting book. Infantry in Battle, 1733 to 1783, hellion.co.uk. Search for Alex Burns if you forget the title, but we will put all of the links and the usual stuff in the descriptors. Go get it, people. And Alex, you're not getting an option on this. Like, we are going to sit down and have a dedicated sort of wrong war style interview where we talk about this in much more depth as Liam rolls his eyes as I roll out the wrong war suggestion there. But anything that is
Was
sort
that
of
was that a Hornblower reference? The Wrong War? What
anything that doesn't happen between about 1775 and 1815 is something that I
Okay.
choose to classify as the wrong war because I'm a
Excellent.
deeply peevish,
Mm,
pugnacious, and
mm.
unpleasant human being, as you may have noticed in previous episodes.
I think there is a Hornblower episode called The
Yeah,
Wrong War, though. So
yeah.
very
Is
good
there?
catch there. Very good catch because that is a cracking TV series.
I will pretend that was all part of the plan because everything is so seamless on this show. Also joining us is Dr. Robert MacNiven. Robbie, welcome back. For those of you who aren't familiar, Robbie is a historian and freelance writer did his MA in War Studies at the University of Glasgow and PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And his focus is on American Revolutionary War massacres. Liam, why haven't we done an interview on that already? Possibly with Dorman, because Dorman has some very amusing takes on the utilization of the word massacre when sort of a couple of people end up with a bloody nose. Um, but that is not to denigrate Robbie's very interesting research. He's published a number of works with Hellion and Osprey dealing with the 18th century way of war and the British Army. Robbie, how are you doing?
I'm excellent, thank you. I'm defecting at the moment because I'm actually currently studying the French Army of the Seven Years' War for my next Osprey project, which is quite eye-opening. I am trying my best to come to terms with the shockingly long and convoluted titles that French colonels have because they're all very senior, they're all aristocrats. They have a lot of names. And I'm also trying to come to terms with the shocking color of French flags during this period. which will upset people with ancien regime leanings, I'm sure. But there are some interesting flags. Like, we're used to red, white, and blue, yellow, maybe something like that, bold colors, primary colors. No, there's awesome leaf color and beige, a lot of lime greens. So anyway, yes, that's what I'm living currently. But it's also very interesting because it's not British for a change.
A lot of beige. I was not expecting you to say beige. I was hoping you were going to kind of roll out purples and things. I was going to think,
There's
ooh,
purple.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
But beige. Ugh. You'll be saying that there are lots of browns in there next. Like
There are some browns. There are some browns.
dear,
Apparently,
oh
the
dear.
color of beige is called Isabelle or Isabeline, which is a specific shade of. It's the color of a sandy horse, apparently. So
Okay. I dislike this. No disrespect to you and your research. It sounds really interesting, but like colors, people, seriously, sort it out. There's probably a whole like actually really interesting conversation about dyes tied in within that we'll come to that another time. Last but by no means least, we have Dr. Andy Dorman in the house. Hello, Dorman. Good to see you. When is your book out? Like, why haven't I got it yet? In fairness, you did send me the text and I haven't given you feedback on it. I am very sorry, but I am drowning in a zillion things. Like, I'm meant to write about 5 books in the next 2 minutes, possibly a slight exaggeration there. But like, when are we seeing it? Because it's coming out with Boyd Ellen Brewer, isn't it?
Yes, so the plan is sometime in March there'll be a manuscript submitted and everything like that, or maybe I need to submit the manuscript beforehand. It next year. I've got to get married first, and then we'll
Congratulations.
do the book. So that's my level of organization. Submit the chapter, get married, or submit the book, get married, and then we'll go from there.
So the important question is your wedding going to be 18th century themed?
It's not. It's themed. I'm getting married on June 6th, which so the theme of the wedding is A Midsummer Night's Invasion of Europe. And I'm planning to arrive by DUKW. That's been vetoed. I also set forward silk and parachute inspired dresses, also vetoed. So I'm losing a lot of battles, but I'm
I
hoping
can't
to
think
win the war.
why.
I know. Tasteless. What can you do?
Oh
But it'll be
dear.
good fun.
Yeah, like your other half clearly has taste. That's all I can really say.
Oh
Um,
yeah. But
but like,
the castle we're getting married in is an 18th century house built in 1718. So I'm happy.
there you go. There you go. You can't say fairer than that. Although,
Yeah.
like, try and squeeze in some Bridgerton themed nonsense. Because why
Oh,
not?
we'll see. We'll see. The table plan, I'm planning to name them after battles, which I think I might get away with. That's the one thing I might win. But well, if it comes to pass, I'll share that with you.
Depends how kind of nuanced and unfamiliar the battles are. Like, if you go with exotic sounding names that, make sense to the history nerds, you'll probably get away with that.
Well, this is it. I mean, if you stick with Western Europe, you just got an assortment of pretty sounding French and German villages. Well, no one's going to object to Fontenoy or Malplaquet.
Maybe. Like, I wish you well with that venture, but I'd rather you than me. Also joining me is Liam Telfer, the podcast redoubtable Tatmaster General, Quartermaster, all round good egg. Hello, mate. How you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Bon earth.
On Earth. I'm not sure we're going to be terribly sensible in this one. Admittedly, I might have set the tone for that with sort of taking the piss out of Sean Bean in the introduction, but when am I going to miss an opportunity like that? Gents, set the scene for us in terms of genesis of light infantry during the 18th century. It's not a John Moore creation. It's not a uniquely sort of Britain during the Napoleonic Wars or the Revolutionary Wars creation. This is something that has a longer history. So talk us through that. Where does it come from? Why does it come from somewhere? Is this really an extension of shut up, Liam, smirking at how cack-handed my questioning is this evening. I've done many interviews and much work today. That's my excuse anyway. But is this just a continuation of what people do in war? Like, light troops are not new really as far back as I can think in history. Like there's always been an idea that you're going to have skirmish troops. That's a thing. So is this just really um a fabrication in our mind that there comes a magical point where people decide that those with muskets should also engage in light infantry tactics, or is there something unique that emerges in the 18th century, and if so, what is that? Alex, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. So in a fashion that I'm sure will delight the listeners, there's a big academic literature on this topic, and basically the debate comes down to in our period in the 18th century, where does it come from? Does it come out of Europe, or does it come out of North America? The experience of British and French colonists over sort of fighting with and against and alongside Native Americans. Or is it something that really has been around in European history, for much of the last 5,000 years? I mean, you've always had light troops, right? You had them in the 30 Years' War. Why are they not there in the 18th century? And long story short, because I'll try to be brief, the current state of the field suggests that it actually probably comes out of Europe, and not out of the experience in North America. The experience, especially in the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, in the Habsburg borderlands, you have a lot of Croatians, or as they're often called, Grenzer, which is a kind of German word that means something like borderers. And so these troops fight alongside the British in the War of Austrian Succession at battles like Fontenoy. They are even kind of copied in some ways by British light infantrymen in the 7 Years' War in terms of like the almost like tight-fitting, like skinny jeans almost type of pants they wear. And if you look sort of broader and beyond this, the French are doing it. The various Western states of Germany, or including the Hessians, are doing it. It's a pretty common experience all throughout 18th century warfare. As you have dedicated light troops. Sometimes these men are rifled armed. Sometimes they're armed with smoothbore muskets like line infantry. But that experience in North America matters, but it's probably not what's driving the reform process in European armies in the mid 18th century.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think um, a lot of stuff starts to happen concurrently, but it would be a mistake to imagine that the North American theatre, because it looms quite large in the British consciousness and obviously the American consciousness, so it assumes a very sort of important role in those nations. But for most of the European powers, they don't care a huge amount or take a huge amount of notice of what necessarily is happening on the frontier in North America during the 7 Years' War. So, the Austrians, the Prussians, etc. They're doing their own thing and they're learning their own thing, which is the value of these light troops. And I mean, Alex actually talks about it himself. I was very much enjoying your book about the Hessians' use of light infantry tactics in the American Revolution, and talking about the flankers. So they're essentially regular Hessian troops that have nevertheless been taught to act in sort of a light infantry fashion, or at least in a skirmishing fashion. And they're capable of doing this and providing that sort of flexibility to their forces without necessarily being, the short jacket and little jockey cap and rifle and that kind of stuff that we associate with light infantry. And a lot of European armies in the 7 Years' War start to kind of have these ad hoc light infantry style units, which aren't necessarily fully fledged the way we imagine light infantry now or in the Napoleonic period, but they were operating as light infantry quite effectively. And sometimes it was just a case of they would be used in action as light infantry in one engagement, and then they wouldn't the next. It was dependent on the situation, on the tactics. So yeah, I think that, as Alex said, the way the literature is moving, it's showing that Europe is really the genesis for at least what we would think of as Napoleonic style light infantry tactics later on, as opposed to the more romantic adventure stuff that's going on in North America. Not to say that that isn't of great interest and importance as well, because we all love that kind of stuff. But in the past, it has detracted from Europe as a hotbed of innovation in the military in this period.
In terms of, you talk about the genesis being in Europe. and it's clearly multinational. It's not like the British come up with this, and then allow other countries to do it. In terms of the sort of international scene of light infantry doctrine, as it were, and or that genesis of light infantry doctrine, who are the main players in this establishment? Who are the guys that are leading the research and the development of light infantry doctrine? And I think it'd probably be interesting. I know we talked about it before. There's quite a lot of cross pollination in the 18th century of military staff visiting other countries, sharing knowledge. And is this, I imagine, is this still the case? Is this the same case, with light infantry?
Yeah, I guess I would say broadly, absolutely. I think it comes out of that army reform process that the British Army goes through during and after the War of Austrian Succession, as the Duke of Cumberland and other leaders are kind of trying to turn their attention to the flaws in the army that they noticed during that war. But essentially, what happens is you need these sort of troops in the Austrian borderlands to fight against the Ottoman Empire. And so the Austrians are maintaining as far back as like the 17 teens, 1720s, units of irregular troops to sort of skirmish against Ottoman forces. And in the course of the War of Austrian Succession, they then go and are deployed up to the Low Countries to fight against the French. The French begin then to form their own units. The one that always stands out to me is, and my French pronunciation is atrocious, but the Chasseurs de Fischer and the Arquebusiers de Grassin, they're important units that are sort of developing French capabilities and sort of doctrines in this way. I will say one I do think the Napoleonic Wars is somewhat unique in this, and I know that's sort of a hot take compared to what I normally think about the Napoleonic Wars in this way. Because for most of this period, with the exception of the British during the War of Independence and after, these units by and large are bulked up and raised during wartime and then fired and demobilized during peacetime. And so you don't have like the 95th, where it's dedicated light infantry trained. They're doing light infantry training during peacetime. The British have some of that. Some of the Austrian units are maintained during peacetime, at least in a limited role. But often the French units, and particularly the Prussian units, the so-called Freikorps, they'll be mobilized in large numbers during wartime and then either turned into different types of soldiers or demobilized during peacetime.
Yeah, the light infantry companies were scrapped in the British Army after the 7 Years' War. So despite the fact that they were seen as quite successful, they still got the chop when it came to trying to cut costs. And then they were reinstituted in 1771 and 72, sort of more towards the American Revolutionary period. In terms of the people who were pushing the development of light infantry tactics in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, there is an element of sort of the scrappy up-and-coming officer. You have various officers who then would go on to become quite famous during the American Revolution, like William Howe and Thomas Gage, who were quite heavily involved in light infantry tactics. William Howe's older brother, George, is killed during the 7 Years' War, but prior to that, he models his regiment, the 55th Foot, on basically light infantry tactics. And this is where you do have to pay tribute to the sort of the mystical elements of the light infantry doctrine in the British Army, because he's tutored by the famous Robert Rogers of Northwest Passage fame, the American frontier ranger, who actually holds a school for British Army officers who attend, and he teaches his supposed bushcrafts and his way of rangering, which is all very sort of dramatic and makes quite a big impression in terms of his own fame. How much it actually impacts the development of doctrine is more debatable, but it does have an influence on people like George Howe, who attempts to create essentially the British Army's first dedicated light infantry units by modifying existing line regiments. And then dedicated ones are raised, not just light infantry companies, but the 80th Foot Gauges regiment are titled the Light Armed Infantry, I think is their initial title, sort of the embryonic version of light infantry. And they go into action in brown uniforms as opposed to red. And, this is where you get all sort of stuff like, it's early camouflage and that kind of thing happening, which, we kind of scoff at a bit because it's so talked about and so overplayed. But, there are elements of truth to it. That is kind of how things were developing. Interesting to note, perhaps, that Gage, part of his reason for pushing his own light infantry unit, the 80th, was because he didn't get on as well with the Rangers and with Rogers. And actually, the British military establishment, as the 7 Years' War unfolded, began to be less enamored with the Rangers because they had to pay them much more money than a British Army regular. So someone in Whitehall said, well, we could maybe just train our own troops to do this and not pay these Rangers quite as much. So there's maybe a bit of a financial incentive there in terms of the British development of light infantry tactics.
I'm seeing Alex nodding enthusiastically. Did you want to come back in on that, Alex?
Oh, I mean, not really. I guess I would say despite the fact that Europe, I think, is in some ways the hotbed driving these large European armies to develop their forces, what's happening in North America matters a great deal. I mean, there are a whole, light infantry cultures, I think, that develop, the French experience particularly, I think is marked sort of by trying to work more closely with Native Americans. And in some ways, I think there probably is some truth to the story, or the popular perception that the British go out in campaigns like the Monongahela in 1755 and are not terribly well prepared to operate in this environment. By 1758, they're doing really well, and they're able to sort of meet the French and their Native American allies on more even terms. But in 1755, recently sort of spun up and mobilized troops are not doing great in a wilderness environment against the French and their native allies.
Yeah, I like how I said, the first question was, I agree completely with Alex that Europe is really the driving force behind this. And the second question, I'm straight in with, wasn't North America cool, though?
I think
it's hard to resist the allure of Last of the Mohicans.
I'm in West Virginia, can confirm.
I think it's important to distinguish, though, between the like light infantry proper and the kind of more shenanigan-based activities that were taking place in North America. Maybe not shenanigan-based, but less professional. Like Rogers Rangers are really interesting and very cool, but these hatchet-wielding, green-jacketed rogues are not in the same sort of they shouldn't necessarily be held in the same conversation. And I think that's one of the things that comes up a lot in the historiography of light infantry is they are all these roguish characters who are super independent. At the same time, they're still professional soldiers. And they're not all these Irishmen and Englishmen and Yorkshiremen gallivanting around Spain. There's a lot more to it than that. And I think the other point as well, going back to the original question, I'd like to drive home is innovation is bred by necessity. Austria has light infantry companies at the start of the War of the Austrian Succession. The Prussians suffer as a result. They develop their own corps, esprit de corps, etc. To a degree. In North America, same again. Necessity breeds innovation. So this, as we talked about in previous episodes, these wars are wars of innovation and tactical doctrine changes. And I think these are like important touchstones. These germination doesn't happen naturally. It takes place as a result of action.
Can I stay with something that you were just talking about there, Dorman, which is the nature of the people who are doing this stuff? And we've got some interesting threads coming out of this through Alex talking about how on the Austrian borderlands, you need these people who can kind of work independently to fend off this threat of incursion versus this sort of mythology that we have of the rank and file of the 95th Rifles, who are the most intelligent people in the army and the ones who think the most independently, and they're the best disciplined and they're the most trusted and they never set a foot wrong, and all of these sort of somewhat nauseating tropes that people like me come along and go, yeah, that's a load of utter horse manure. So can I talk about the people who are recruited into these units? Because my admittedly not extensive knowledge of how recruitment works, particularly within the British Army, does rather lead me to conclude that nobody's doing an IQ test when somebody turns up at the recruiting depot. So this idea, I might have been ever so slightly flippant there, but this idea that, you're taking the most intelligent people and sort of drafting them out for these separate special battalions just doesn't work in terms of how we know recruitment works during this time. You take what you're given. You're just grateful in many instances if you're trying to fill the ranks. So am I right to sort of poke holes in the balloon that is the hyper intelligent kind of trope of the classic light infantryman? And if there is something that characterizes light infantry soldiers, what would you say that is?
So I think I'd like to quote the British Army on this, if I may. So I'm sitting in front of the regimental returns for 1778 for the regiments that were based in Ireland. This is the light companies of the 3rd, 11th, 19th, 30th, 32nd, 36th, 66th, 67th, and 68th. They're all brigaded together and they all perform their drills together. And I'll quote the general observations. A very fine corps, some few men undersized, rather too slight, owing, I imagine, to an unwillingness in commanding officers to detach their best men from their regiment when first assembling them. So that suggests that these aren't necessarily the best soldiers that are being cherry-picked for this. Perhaps there's a different quality. Now, they don't go into those qualities. Maybe there is an intellectual component to it. But physically speaking, anyway, they're not the most impressive soldiers, which I think is quite interesting. Maybe are other qualities being teased out, because of course absence of information does not preclude that they, as we know. But I mean, they perform their drill quite well, but it's all regular drill. They don't do kind of fancy light infantry things here, and they're all considered, clean underarms, tolerably dressed, gaiters according to order, which is of course critical. So that was the British Army perspective, but I'll hand over to someone who knows more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think.
Go ahead, Robbie.
I think there is an element of truth to. Well, first of all, I feel as though some elements in the officer corps did actually get caught up in the hype during the period. It's not just us who kind of, in this modern day, try and imagine or impose upon the light infantry of the period and say, oh, they were like the SAS and stuff. There's a set of instructions written for light infantry in Ireland in 1772, which describes basically the characteristics that light infantry should have, and they're basically like the perfect soldier. It says that they should be good shots, they should be quick, they should be independent, they should be able to march for miles, and all these sorts of things. And this was genuine recommendations of the period. So it's not necessarily just us saying, oh, they probably weren't as elite as we now think they are. They were thought of, or they should at least be elite. Whether they were or not is a different thing, especially in wartime. From what I've seen, the primary motivator for the British light infantry and grenadier regiments or companies during the American Revolution was just keeping them at full strength, because their attrition rate was huge. They would suffer sort of 3 times the number of losses in a company over the course of about 18 months. And the primary concern was ensuring that troops continue to be funneled into these battalions, because they it's become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their eliteness means that they are now sort of being utilized constantly on the front line wherever possible. So the concern, if we're in sort of a mid or late war period, is it's certainly not, the short guys have to be light infantry and the tall guys have to be grenadiers. It's just keeping the numbers up. But nevertheless, officers complain frequently from battalion companies that the best troops are being sent off to the light and grenadier companies. So I don't think it's all just sort of like hokum, and it's not all just they just thought of themselves as elite, but were they actually any better? I think there was at least an understanding that they should be better. Whether they were or not, that's more open to debate.
And I think if we're going to answer this question fully, it's probably worth unpacking the various types of light infantry across these armies real briefly here. So when we talk about light infantry companies, that's something the British do. That's something the Americans eventually will do. That's troops that are recruited to be part of the 50th foot or whatever, and then those companies would often split off to fight alongside and together with the light infantry companies of other battalions. And so you have things like the 2nd Battalion of Light Infantry, which is an amalgamation of all of these different companies of light infantry from various regiments that fight together. Now, my understanding is, and I'm confident Robbie can correct me if I'm wrong, is that for much of the War of Independence, the light infantry aren't actually doing a ton of light infantry work. They're more like assault troops. And indeed, that's the same case in the American Army during the war. When the Americans, I'm American, so I'm saying we, when we raise infantry, like light infantry units in the War of Independence, we're not using them much like light infantrymen. We're using them like grenadiers, like assault forces. I mean, they attack at Stony Point, as I recall. And so That's one form of light infantry, essentially troops that are recruited into line regiments and then basically mashed together with other light infantry companies and sent out to go fight as battalions. Then you have almost like a weird martial race theory type light infantry. We've got men from the foothills of Croatia in the Austrian Empire. We've got huntsmen from Germany who are wearing green coats and have short little rifles. We're going to group them into units because they sort of fight in a unique way, and we want to use their martial traditions basically to form units out of whole cloth. That's another form. And then last but not least, you have these combined arms units that are sometimes even called mercenaries. I don't think that's a super helpful distinction, but these are raised during wartime, and you often see them called like corps. So like Fry Corps, I would say the Chasseur de Fisher is an example of this as well. They have artillery, they have light infantrymen. It's almost like what will later become, at least in America, called a legion, where you have infantry, artillery, light cavalry, riflemen, kind of all mashed together into one unit. That's designed to give you operational superiority, to gather intelligence, to blind the enemy army in the operational level of war. The light infantrymen in the British Army, in the American Army, frequently they're being used more like assault troops. And I would say the kind of martial races light infantrymen, the Jaeger in Germany, the Grenzer in the Habsburg borderland, they're also more like that kind of operationally useful light infantry. You see them on the battlefield, absolutely. The Prussians are terrified of them in the War of Austrian Succession. But the kind of three different groups, we might say, and they're each trying to do their own thing throughout the 18th century.
Yeah, that's a very useful separation. You also preempted me. That was going to be my cool closing point. I was going to say that the British light infantry in the American Revolution didn't even fight as light infantry. They actually would just use like grenadiers. But you've said it, and it's all good.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting to mention as well the Jaeger that are used by sort of the Prussian-leaning German states, because they also have this thing where they're all huntsmen, they're all gamekeepers, they're all crack shots, and I haven't researched enough about them to know if that's true or not. But my gut instinct is no, they can't have that many gamekeepers in like these little German states. They do acquit themselves very well in the American Revolution anyway. So for what I do know of them is they were very effective, and they did actually act as light troops, unlike a lot of the so-called British light infantry. So yeah, there's something in that certainly.
I just want to follow up a little bit what you were saying there, Alex, about some of the martial race stuff and how potentially the irregular forces, the indigenous populations, particularly obviously in North America, and how much does their way of warfare and their tactical, nuances, how much influence does that play in the establishment of what we would call light infantry in the west, I say European sense. Obviously, I think you could probably group some of the way America wages war at the time into that European aspect as well. And I think similar, for other parts of the world, you mentioned the Ottomans, and in India as well, especially, you've got, swathes of very irregular infantry, light infantry forces. How much does that influence the development of standard light infantry, if that makes sense?
Sure, that's a really good question, and I guess my mind immediately goes to the journal of General Liedesel, who's a soldier from Brunswick fighting alongside one of those quote unquote Hessians. He's not actually from Hesse, but who's fighting with the British in the War of Independence, and he looks at the style of British fighting in the American War, and basically says, well, the British, they cover themselves by means of trees or like laying down when they're under fire. And this isn't necessarily light infantrymen doing this. This is British line regiments. And he says they learned this from the Indians and to some extent from the French in the last war, in the French War, in the French and Indian War. So I think you could look at that and say there's certainly a degree of learning. Now, I'm going to say, give a quote here that's a little bit edgy, I guess we might say. In the campaign in 1758, General John Forbes is writing about the need for more native sort of trained troops, and really he wants more Indians to fight alongside his men, because there's kind of sort of a martial race theory. I'm trying to get to Pittsburgh, or what will become Pittsburgh. I got to hack my way through the wilderness. I'm going to need native forces, and by the time the campaign's over, he thinks it's actually probably easier to train British soldiers to fight like Native Americans than it is to actually get the Native Americans to work effectively with his own men. And you can bleep this all out, I guess, if you don't want me to be on the podcast. But he says we must make Indians of our white men. That would be easier than dealing with this damn tawny race. So there is absolutely, I think, a uh, martial races component to this, trying to turn the fighting style of British soldiers more to be like Native Americans, as opposed to maybe working alongside Native Americans. These guys think it's easier to do that. Um,
Can I just go and complicate this picture even further? Partly because Alex is talking there about attitudes of a particular officer in that instance, but officers are clearly an integral part of this. We haven't yet done an episode really on leadership per se and what constitutes good leadership during this period. We'll make that installment number 34 of this series, perhaps. But nonetheless, the officers are an important aspect of this. If you are going to use a different style of fighting, you need the officers to be able to control the men. Fundamentally, that's a crude way of putting it, but essentially this is about command and control. And so control matters. You need, I would argue, a slightly different approach to discipline than the norm and the perception, not to make this a discipline episode, but there's a need for a certain quality there. You need the officers to also have that additional element of ability to read a situation, arguably, because you are detached from that more traditional, very hierarchical structure. So, do we have a sense of the particular qualities that are sought in terms of the officers, which, of course, is a very kind of problematic comment to make in the sense that commissions are bought, certainly in the British army during this period, and you've got people raising their own regiments in some cases. So cronyism is very much alive and well, and if you want to buy a commission in the 85th or whatever the unit might be, well then who's going to stop you? If you've got the money, well yes, well then lovely, thank you very much, I'll be taking that and you can have your commission, sort of thing. So do we therefore, if that is actually what dominates the selection of officers or the acquisition of officers within these light infantry units, do we see problems emerging off the back of that which influence combat effectiveness?
So if I could jump in for a moment, kind of across military Europe, and I won't say much about Britain, leave it for the other guys, but often these units are not viewed as being terribly prestigious. If you want to be a successful nobleman, you'll have a commission in a heavy cavalry regiment, the sort of long, sort of standing, old serving infantry regiment, and so it's almost like more like the bourgeois or like the middle class that frequently is there. Maybe the lower nobility or the also out on the out on their heels. That nobility is trying to raise these units, lead these units. Frequently in the Central European case, they're actually raised and paid for by these maybe middle class guys who have a bit more money, who are trying to make their reputation and break into the higher nobility. And so in that way, you've got an ambitious kind of social climber class that's trying to kind of make their reputation through light infantry work. A lot of scoundrels. You have people like Pandor Trenck, in the Habsburg lands. I mean, he's essentially a war criminal, is what we'd say today. He was sort of going around, doing all kinds of untoward stuff, and has a great reputation as a light infantry and light cavalry commander. Eventually is run down by the authorities and sort of put in prison. It's a if you are trying to really get in good with the king, you'll approach him about raising a regiment of this sort. You'll go out and lead it. You'll do well. Maybe after the war, you might get put into command like a garrison regiment or sort of one of these permanent sort of fixtures of the state military. But there's almost like like, I won't say like dangerous and exciting or something like this, but like light infantry and particularly in the Central European theater, these units are viewed as being marginal, composed of deserters, not the best troops. Maybe they plunder a little bit more. There are a lot of, I think, negative stereo. If we're talking about martial race theory, there are a lot of negative stereotypes attached to light infantry units in addition to kind of the vital operational tasks that they perform.
I've got a question for Alex, actually. I ask the questions now. With the Austrians, so the Grenzers and stuff, was their officer corps sort of Austrian military, or were they also Grenzers? I'm just thinking about like in Scotland, obviously the Highland officers were Highlanders because they'd been sort of thoroughly Hanoverianized by the 7 Years' War, at least. It's not as though they have to have English commanders in Scottish regiments. So that wasn't a thing, but I was just interested. Is that the case with the Grenzers? Do you know?
Yeah, there are a lot of native officers, and I think the one that always comes to my mind is Shushkovich.
Okay.
He's so good at kind of doing the Grenzer light infantry stuff that he eventually gets into like brigade and corps command, and kind of takes from that a real interest in like applying light infantry doctrines to the whole of the army. And so the troops under his command do more like shooting at marks or target shooting. Shooting at marks, what they call it in the 18th century, as a whole. So yeah, there are cases where initially one of these kind of martial race area light infantry commanders gets up into sort of more traditional army command and applies light infantry ideas, I would say more broadly across the army. Um, by and large, I mean, the Austrian force is such a mishmash. I mean, the actual regiments of Grenzer are commanded by local men. By the time you get into even, I would say, like a brigade level, I mean, you could have like a guy from northern Italy in charge, or
Yeah, of
someone
course.
from Bohemia. It's a very much a transnational empire, transnational force. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting. With regards to sort of the British officer corps promotion and patronage and commission buying and stuff, it's noted by officers, certainly in the American Revolution, that it's a good way to get ahead because people die a lot in the light infantry companies because they're always on the front line. So it feeds into what Alex was saying as well about sort of like scrappy, maybe not the wealthiest, but looking for career advancement. It's a good place to go if you don't mind a bit of danger and adventure to go with your attempt at climbing the ladder. And I mean, you just have to look at the upper echelons of the command in the American Revolution. It's William Howe and Thomas Gage and people who were light infantry officers in the 7 Years' War. They eventually become the guys in charge. So clearly there is opportunity there somewhere down the line. It's also probably worth stating that at least in the British Army, because the regiment was so dependent on the effectiveness of its colonel, it could vary a great deal, regiment by regiment. So with the 33rd Foot Cornwallis's regiment, he, before it was sent to America, made sure that he had a good light infantry commander in charge of his light company. The guy who was in charge was deemed to be too old and unfit, and he was just ousted and replaced by someone that Cornwallis thought was more competent, because Cornwallis was able to do that because he had the power and the wealth and patronage and stuff. So he simply replaced the light infantry captains almost on, well, it was actually on the eve of shipping out from Ireland. And sadly, the previous captain then killed himself because he was so distraught at having been turned over. He jumped off the pier into the sea and was never seen again. So there was incentives from colonels who wanted, to have competent regiments to make sure that light infantry officers were capable because they knew they were going to see a lot of action.
I'm very curious there about what Alex is saying about sort of some of the negative stereotypes that some of these units have versus what Robbie was saying about, there's this ideal of what the perfect light infantry recruit might be. Is there a sense of the light infantry pulling sort of straining every sinew, perhaps at an officer level upwards, to try and bolster the reputation of these units? And part of what I'm thinking about here is I've always wondered why the Light Division of the Peninsular War just seems wholesale to churn out every single memoir they possibly can. And that's kind of what ends up dominating the perception that it's, the Light Division who does all the hard work in Wellington's army during the Peninsular War. And if the Light Division weren't there, then clearly, a significant battle wasn't fought that day. And I wonder if, apologies for the flippancy, but it's kind of a trope that emerges from it. And I wonder how much of that is basically about people compensating here. As somebody who has looked at the desertion stats, like the desertion stats for the 95th ain't that great. Like they're not catastrophic, but they're not the best in the army by a long stretch. And I wonder if there is that sort of that sensitivity to reputation. And I know that is there in other units anyway. We are at that point where regimental identity is starting to become a real thing. But is there some of this kind of compensation going on to try and fight this existing kind of negative stereotype and replace it with a fundamentally better PR? Dorman, do you want to start on that?
Oh, that is a very good question. This idea of kind of countering negative reputations and perceptions. I don't know if they're doing it any more than any other regiment, to be honest. I think that maybe they do have something to prove, but if they're being, as discussed, they're being deployed in a shock role. They are being thrust into the heart of combat, where you either prove yourself or you don't. And in the same way, grenadiers had to do the same thing in British service or in other service too. I mean, there's that great quote about French grenadiers in Canada where the guy says, "I need more grenadiers. I don't have enough grenadiers." Anytime you want something done, they send grenadiers, this sort of thing. So perhaps it's simply adding a distinction leads to the need to prove oneself. I don't know if it's necessarily a light infantry thing or simply a military thing. But I just like to jump back quickly to the previous question. I just want to mention something very quickly. I was looking through the regimental returns in the background of what Alex and Robbie were saying. And what's fascinating is in a traditional British Army regiment that's based in Ireland in this period, you've got maybe 24, 25 junior officers who'd be Irish. There's 6 in the light companies. They're mostly English, which is quite unusual for this. And I do wonder why that is. I can't answer that, but I would love to look more into that and think, why are the light officers all English and they're not Scotch or Irish?
It's pure speculation here, but trust, maybe? Thinking about, the recent history for, it is not a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland yet anyway, but there is a lot of concern about that. And do you really want these guys to kind of these men to be staffed by officers who might have questionable loyalties? I'm speculating here, but
or is it preferential treatment or preferential hiring practice? I don't know. Just thought
I'm sure we can get a whole episode out of this in the future.
Yeah.
We need to go away and do our research and come back and find out the answer to this.
Just jumping back in for the question that was asked. I will say there's probably something to the bourgeois nature of the guys who are in the light units, and I don't want to sort of fall into a trap of thinking that like the old nobility who's got all the money is not very literate and doesn't write interesting things. They absolutely do. But when I think of like the best memoirs of the War of Independence. I think of people like Johann Ewald. He's the son of a postmaster, so there's a sort of a literate tradition in his family. I think of people like General sort of Martin Hunter, who's in the 2nd Battalion of Light Infantry. They do absolutely write a lot about their experiences. I don't know necessarily that they're trying to claim that they're doing any better than any other regiment. Kind of following on what Dorman said, all regiments are trying to say, "Oh, we're the best in the army. We're esprit de corps, winning battles." This is a pretty bog standard stuff in military memoirs. But maybe there's a bit more like of a voluminous literary tradition in light infantry, background forces as a result of you know, the social background of these men, you know, the desire to sort of prove themselves. Um, but by and large, that's still coming from the officer class. I mean, Avald's an officer, obviously Martin Hunter's an officer. I do kind of to your point about the light division in the peninsula, though. And again, Robbie can correct me if I'm wrong here. He's written more about this than I have, but there's this sense that the light infantry forces in the War of Independence on the British side are the best troops in the army. That I mean, to some extent, it comes down to like having almost like a sugar daddy general like Howe who's really invested in the light forces and their work. It sort of makes their reputation. I always think of the interaction between the Second Battalion of Light Infantry and Howe at the start of the Battle of Germantown. He comes in and you know they're retreating from a very large American attack, and he's like, "What are you idiots doing? Like, you know, it's just a small American force, and you are the best guys. Like, you know, why are you running away?" And then a canister blast goes through the tree right next to him, and all like Hunter writes in his diary. One of these light infantry officers, we felt pretty great that, you know, the general realized it was a serious attack and we weren't running away from nothing. So, you know, there's a sense here, I think, of when you've got a general that really leans in to the light infantry work, that there's kind of, you know, as I kind of flippantly said, like the sugar daddy of the light infantry, they do have this same reputation like they have in the peninsula of being a really elite force that, you know, again, if the second battalion of light infantry isn't there isn't anything really happening in the War of Independence. I think that you could say that equally maybe with the peninsula and back in this war.
Yeah. It almost feels as though, I think it's interesting that Andrew brought up grenadiers. It feels as though light infantry slowly supplant grenadiers as like the premier elite in the popular imagination throughout the 18th century. You know, before the 7 Years' War, the grenadier is held up as this thing. You know, if you say, "Oh, he's a grenadier," or whatever, he served with the grenadiers, and he's seen as, you know, experienced, and he's probably a big guy, and he's probably been in loads of battles, and he's got a big mustache, and he's got loads of scars. And I think that, you know, that concept of the most elite troops is supplied. I mean, it's why Sharpe is a light infantryman, not a grenadier. You know, Bernard Cornwall, you know, by the Napoleonic Wars, the light infantry are seen as at least as interesting as the grenadiers are. And so, yeah, I guess that's more to do with just like perception and popular history and public perception and things like that. But yeah, it morphs over the century, and I think that is probably due in part because of just how much action the light infantry do genuinely see in the conflicts of the latter part of that century.
Is that to do with, I guess, the changing face of warfare? Yeah, because I mean, if you look at War Spanish Succession, maybe even into Austrian Succession, big men, big hats, slowly walk at enemy. Whereas you get more light stuff happening later on. So it's simply a case that the war is changing, so the sexy regiment is changing.
Yeah, I could be persuaded by that. You know, you think of the early period of the 18th century, what is the most extreme warfare you could imagine? It's storming a breach. What have you got there? Grenadiers and tall hats, big mustaches. That's like just a popular image of the early 18th century warfare. And then certainly if you're thinking about North America and from the middle to the end of the period, you're thinking of Rangers and Native Americans and all sorts of light infantry shenanigans. So yeah, this is also probably veering into a separate topic about the popular perception of grenadiers versus light infantry during the 18th century.
We should do a whole episode on grenadiers, just throwing it out.
I would definitely be up for that, Alex. I think that's a brilliant. I'm a big man and I look good in a big hat. I think, Robbie, you hit the nail on the head, and it's definitely, I think, like Andy says, it's the changing nature of warfare, but also, you know, action creates reaction, both in a contemporary sense, you know, from dispatches and what's being printed in the press at home. And when you have light infantry, whether they're being used as light infantry or not, that shock, that action, everyone wants to write about the sharp end, everyone wants to read about the sharp end, and it then becomes that cycle of, well, these guys are awesome, and it, you know, going back to what Zach was talking about, that sort of reputational thing, it's only going to boost reputation whether or not you are victorious. If you're in the front line and you're doing everything really bravely, whether you'll win or not, the press don't care to a certain degree, do they? They want a good story, and they will spin it for the public either way. And I think that probably plays into the the romanticism and the romanticizing, sorry, of light infantry as we go, go into the later part of the 18th century and early 19th century. But I think it'd be a really good time, having mentioned our green jacketed Yorkshiremen. I think you guys can really unleash on this. Bring your best myth busting fury. And what are the really common misconceptions and the big tropes that surround light infantry in the 18th century? Bearing in mind, we don't have, this could probably be an episode in itself. We don't have all night, but what are some of the biggest tropes and misconceptions?
Beards in North America, especially among the Rangers. No beards allowed. No one has beards anytime, anywhere in the 18th century at all whatsoever. At most, like 2 days stubble. Even then, even if you're on a big raid, like anything shy of like the St. Francis raid, where they were literally eating the bark off trees to survive as they went home, maybe allow some little shaving, no shaving there. But apart from that, no beards, please.
I guess a big one that I'll just throw out, and maybe we can do more about this in a future episode, is that the line infantry can't fight like light infantrymen. I mean, a lot of in these 18th century battles, and see my forthcoming book if you want to hear more. But you have a light infantrymen, are off doing assaulty type things, and the regular line infantrymen are fighting in ways that we think of as light infantry work. So they're throwing themselves to the ground with the enemy's firing. They're taking cover. They're fighting from houses. They're engaged in some cases literally in the act of skirmishing, especially in the Western 7 Years' War, especially by the Hessian, the troops actually from Hessen Kassel, in the War of Independence, actually go out and fight as bog standard skirmisher in a Napoleonic style. You take a set number of men from the company, you deploy them out in front of the formed body of the battalion in order to clear the way. I mean, it's really. It's stuff that looks a lot like Napoleonic warfare, or what we think Napoleonic warfare looks like in the 18th century warfare doesn't, and it's happening back in the 18th century.
Yeah, I mean, during the Battle of Brandywine, a Grenadier company comes to the rescue of light infantry, British light infantry, and they just fight as light infantry, like in the style of light infantry. They can literally just all do the same thing, and they just all do the same things. They're able to split up and maneuver by companies and stuff like that. So yeah, the revolution there's like, everyone's light infantry and no one's light infantry. It's very fluid.
I think that the point I'd like to drive home is they didn't all have rifles, guys. We can, like, they may or may not have been better shots if training was, there lots of discipline and target shooting, as Alex mentioned. But they didn't all have these super weapons. And I think Robbie could wax lyrical about marksmen in the American service in this conflict as well. Or in conflicts talked about. But yeah, I think that's a big one that constantly is borne out, that they are these miraculously accurate sharpshooters and snipers. It's just, they were competent, sure, but at the same time they were doing it with smoothbore muskets, as Alex said, with normal equipment. They were in many ways normal soldiers, just doing something slightly different.
Yeah, just earlier this morning, Liam and I were recording with somebody who's an expert on gunsmiths fundamentally and the making of these firearms. And it's once you sort of get into the nuts and bolts of how these are being made that you realize that, well, barn doors like are a nice target, but lots of luck in terms of actually hitting it beyond more than a couple of 100 meters. So I think it's a really nice point to make. But I do want to start to sort of bring this not full circle, but kind of round to thinking about legacy, but also with an eye on the sort of myth busting thing. One of the things that irritates me is this idea that people in history don't learn anything and that they're all dumb. And some lessons are learned in a war. And then the second the peace treaty is signed, everyone's like, okay, yeah, lovely. Well, do we do some that's yesterday's news. We don't need to worry about that. Like, nobody writes anything down. Nobody embraces these ideas and thinks about how they can absorb them into tactical doctrine in the future. Everybody just forgets instantaneously and has sort of immediate amnesia. And the big one there, I think, is probably, certainly within the research that I've done and the reading that I've done, American Revolutionary War through to the French Revolutionary War, in that sense that, well, the British apparently go and learn some things and then immediately forget them, sort of thing. So what is the legacy kind of feeding through from these conflicts? Because there is one. So as you go from sort of 7 Years' War through to American Revolution, through to revolutionary wars in Europe, what is the kind of feed through? What are the legacies and what are the sort of the movements that we start to see? Robbie, do you want to start on that?
I mean, there is some truth to the concept that things were forgotten by the British Army after the Revolution. It wasn't so much that they were forgotten; it was more that there was a tussle between different factions of British High Command, as there so often is, and the faction that didn't want to emulate North American style tactics in Europe won out basically. So, yeah, you had to then kind of take a step back to go 2 steps forward, and it would be a while before you had things like Shorncliffe and um, Sir John Moore. I nearly called him Roger Moore there. That would have been good. Sir John Moore, who himself was a veteran of the American Revolution, bringing it back into style. But it's complicated because, as we've said, the way that light infantry operate in North America isn't necessarily the way light infantry operate during the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars, especially if it's sort of French light infantry doctrine, it's kind of the whole Napoleonic doctrine of basically spam. Why have 100 light infantry when you can have 1,000 light infantry and throw them ahead of your massive columns and do things like that? So that is very different from North American light infantry tactics because it's a question of mass and a question of numbers, which you just don't have in North America. So it's understandable in a sense as to why these lessons couldn't be applied as rigorously when it came to European battlefields. And certainly, I think every European nation had its own legacy, its own light infantry legacy, tracing back to the 7 Years' War and the War of the Austrian Succession, and they all bring that through during the Napoleonic period. I mean, famously, Napoleon refuses to have riflemen because whatever. I don't even know the history behind that. Maybe there's some myth busting that needs to be done. But as far as I'm aware, he just didn't really rate it because it wasn't his part of his tactical doctrine of mass and force. And you don't need. It doesn't come down to a guy making a shot really accurately. It comes down to having 100 cannons grouped together and battering away at the enemy's line. So yeah, I'm getting into rambling territory now, but yeah, that was the reason essentially that the British didn't necessarily carry through. Even though the light infantry were very popular in the American Revolution, they realized that it wouldn't necessarily be applicable in a major European land war. And then when that did kick off, they were able to kind of cherry pick the important elements and bring that through.
Yeah, if I could jump in there for a minute. I mean, two things come to me listening to Robbie there. First of all, I think you really learn the most after a war when you've gotten whooped up on pretty horribly. And so the War of Austrian Succession is a big moment where you learn if you're the British. And the 7 Years' War is a big moment when you learn when you're the French. And the 7 Years' War is right in that moment in the military enlightenment, with a lot of theorists are saying, hey, we need to have regular infantrymen trained to do light infantry things. And so the French really, I think, lean into every soldier could fight as a skirmisher if he has to, and we'll have we'll have light companies, things like this. Um, Whereas a lot of other European armies, they're getting to that same conclusion slightly later, as a result of how the reform process is happening, say in somewhere like Prussia, that's not doing similar things until the War of Bavarian Succession and beyond. The second thing I'll say is it's really great to fight in infantry as a light infantryman in North America because there are a lot of trees and there are a lot of heavy cavalry. Turns out heavy cavalry, if you're not going to bayonet on the end of your rifle, you're not going to do a lot against that. And so as a result, I think when really light infantrymen are very useful in the War of Independence, they're very useful even in European battlefields like at Parma and Guastalla in the 1730s in northern Italy, where for reasons, of terrain or of operational mistakes, cavalry really aren't on the battlefield in force. But a lot of the lessons tactically of the war in North America aren't always super applicable to European battlefields because you've got way more heavy artillery. Although Burgoyne has a lot of cannons with him, you've got a lot more and a wider variety of heavy cavalry. And so the things that work great in North America and make a lot of sense in North America, you can apply them to Europe, but it's not always a one-for-one transition.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. I think that's a great note on which to wrap up today's adventure through the 18th century. You've been listening to Dr. Robbie MacNiven, a freelance writer and historian, Dr. Andrew Dorman, also historian and writer, and Dr. Alexander Burns, assistant professor of history at Franciscan University of Steubenville. This has been Light Infantry in the 18th Century, and the Napoleonic Wars podcast will be back very soon.
Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car, and then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds, and if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top-rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NatWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.